Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Greg Masters, and I'm the managing editor of SC Magazine. And welcome to the next session in our e-symposium on data privacy and security, Data Breaches, Privacy, the Insider, and You, sponsored by SpectorSoft. Data breaches involving the insider are on the rise. Whether inadvertent or malicious in intent, the privileged employee has more opportunity to do damage than other threat sources. Here to explain how you can quickly detect breaches, accurately define the extent of a data breach, and effectively identify gaps in security is Nick Cavalancia, SpectorSoft's Vice President of Marketing. Nick has more than 18 years of enterprise IT experience and has authored and contributed to more than a dozen books on Microsoft technologies. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Greg. You make me sound like I'm a techno wizard, I think.
Yeah.
So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. As Greg mentioned, I've been in IT for a large number of years, so I'm sort of the reluctant VP of marketing. Been spending more time as a technologist than I think as a marketer. But what we're going to talk about today is relatively simple. Before I do, let me just tell you briefly about SpectorSoft, and just 4 quick things, and we'll get jumping into the material here. We've been around about 15 years. We're headquartered in Florida. We do have more than 36,000 business customers, everything from 10 seats to 50,000 seats and everything in between. And we are an 8-time Inc. 500 to 5,000 recipient, which makes SpectorSoft a very well-established company. So jumping into the topic of data breaches, there's 3 issues here that I want to address. The first one is the state of data breaches. The second one is how do you best detect them? And then defining the cost of data breach, all kind of revolving around the insider within your organization. So some of you may have seen this next slide's content a little bit in the synopsis of this presentation. And it was basically kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying, let's stop data breaches completely when it comes to the insider. And I remember finding this on the Internet. A floppy lock from Kensington. Some of you are kind of, I remember those, yeah. Back when the floppy was the only way to take data off a machine, this was your DLP solution. This was your insider threat detection and excuse me, frog in my throat, your deterrence, methodology. All you had to do is block the floppy. But now, of course, there's many, many other ways for data to leave the organization. So today, all you need to do is, in order to block the insider from taking data, is block the entire Internet. Seems easy enough. Eliminate all printing whatsoever. Restrict access to any medium that data could leave a machine. Now, it was problem solved. They put there. Now, of course, I'm being very, very sarcastic because you'd look at this and go, there's no way I could do any of that. Now, there are organizations that do this. I have talked to some where they're completely locked down. However, most organizations, this is not going to work for them. Employees aren't going to be happy, or people need to be able to get their jobs done by accessing the Internet or printing or copying something to USB stick or whatever the case is. So we have to look a little deeper. We can't just go with, let's just block everything. By the way, just to give you a real-world example, back when cell phones first had cameras, Samsung was making a cell phone with a camera, and that phone wasn't allowed to be used in the I'm losing my train of thought here, in the building where they manufactured the phone. So in essence, you couldn't use the phone in the place it was manufactured because they don't want people taking pictures of how the phone was being manufactured. It kind of seems like sort of like a weird catch-22 of some kind. But so there are companies that have done this, and they've just blocked all ways for data to leave the organization. So let's look at the state of data breaches first. What do we have today? Where does the insider fit in? What are the big risks, and so on? So every year, Verizon puts out their data breach investigations report. I've got a bit.ly link over there on the right, a short URL in case you want to go take a look at it. Great report. It's very long. I think it's 60-some-odd pages. And they, of course, always identify the external and the internal threats. The external being mostly hackers. By and large, those end up being the largest number of breaches involving the external threats. That is, out of the 47,000 security incidents, I think there were 600 and some odd actual data breaches. 92% of the time, external was involved. Now, that doesn't surprise me at all just because of the pure opportunistic nature of external threats. They even talk about that in the data breach investigations report. It's very simple for someone who's a hacker to simply say, go scan every IP address and every port address on the planet and find me some holes. So, of course, those numbers are going to be overwhelming because people are using automated tools. The internal threat, of course, is the employee, the insider with access to data. And it's important to kind of even take that insider with access a step further in concept and talk about those that have appropriate access. So someone whose job it is to access, let's say, a record with a social security number or a credit card, they have access to that data. So you have to be watching that insider as well. Now, they're only involved in around 14% of the data breaches. However, keep in mind that, again, the numbers are overwhelming on the external side just because of the automated nature. But I really want to focus on the internal threats a little bit. But before I do, let's just look at some other stats that come out of the 2013 Data Breach Investigations Report. The first one is the fact that I kind of summed it up this way. They're getting better, you're getting worse. So the external and the internal threats, they're getting better at doing what they want to do, and you and I, trying to thwart it or detect it and so on, we're getting worse at our job. And here's some stats why. So 69% of all the exfiltration, that's the actual portion of the process of taking the data breach, actually taking the data out of the organization, took seconds to hours. Now, the reason why we're getting worse is last year it was only 60%. So they're getting better at very quickly taking data out of the organization. So now you're getting worse because 66% of discoveries took months to years. This kind of jibes perfectly with like the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They always put out their annual report on fraud, and the numbers are just eerily aligned between Verizon's report and the ACFE's report about how long it takes discovery to take place. Theirs is somewhere between 18 months and 3 years. So you've got a perfect alignment here as well. Now, you're getting worse because that number's up from 55% last year. So it's taking them shorter amounts of time to take data out of the organization, and it's taking you longer periods of time to discover it even happening and then addressing it afterwards. So then if we kind of go back up to the top of this slide to look at external and internal threats, where do you need to focus? Now, external threats are actually down by 6%. So while they are still an overwhelming majority, again, automated tools end up just bumping up that number, but they still decreased 6% year over year. But here's the shocking one. Internal threats increased by 2.5 times. So they are on the rise. Now, it's important to note that it could be the malicious insider. It could also be the unwitting participant. So kind of keep that in mind. But in either case, the internal threats are definitely on the increase, and that's something that we need to focus on. So let's talk about the state of the insider. What do they think it's okay to do? Now, in this case, I'm going to kind of throw up some stats here that I've also got. I'll show you some Bitly links so you can take a look at the sources and whatnot. This could be about someone who's malicious or, again, not malicious intent, but just ends up breaching data on their own. First off here, you see transferring documents to a personal device. A huge percentage of people think that's absolutely fine to do. Anytime you need to put up on Dropbox, it's okay. I can get it from home then on my laptop at home, and totally okay. It's okay to take corporate data when you leave. Half of people think that are working for companies taking corporate data is totally fine. This should be like, I've got to be making this up, right? And I'm not. These are actual surveys, data put out by Symantec and there's another company, Kessler, who's a consulting firm, and they did some surveys of employees asking them what they thought was okay to do. Next one, reusing source code from an old company. This focuses primarily on development, but they were asking employees in general, do you think it's okay for a company if a person who developed the source code at company A goes to company B and reuses it, is that okay? And most people, you see here, well, not most, I shouldn't say that, but 40% of people thought it's okay to do that. And then the last one here is pure out stealing corporate intelligence. 18% of people thought it was fine. And you've got those links there at the bottom in case you want to take a look at those. So this is telling you the insider, if you kind of sum this up, the idea behind it is that data that is clearly owned by the company, intellectual property, customer lists, personally identifiable information, even just the stuff that you and I need to work on in order to get our jobs done, companies are not relaying to employees that is something that belongs to the company. It should not leave. It should not be taken out. Don't put it on Dropbox. You can't use it when you go to your next job, this kind of thing, because people have a very lackadaisical attitude toward it. So we've got this insider threat that's already growing. And we've got a mindset of the insider where they're thinking it's okay to take data. I'm fine doing it. So let's talk about how to best detect these breaches because they're going to happen. You mix those two things together, you know they're going to happen. So you have to be able to answer 4 basic questions when you're trying to detect breaches. The first question is when. When did it happen? And this is kind of important. This goes back to the months to years issue, right? How long it takes to detect a breach. And so you want to be able to know when something happened in order to determine maybe how much damage has been done, how long has it been going on, how much data do I have to review in order to figure out how long it's been going on, and so on. So when did it happen? Next one is, how did it happen? And this actually deals with that issue that we talked about as part of one of the topics here, is identifying your security gaps. Knowing how it happened is going to be critical. There was just a story the other day of an Australian telecom company, Telstra, and somebody posted a bunch of customer information in an Excel document that got picked up by Google. And I read on the company blog, they said, we spent tireless hours trying to determine how this happened, so they can close the security gap. The same stuff you're doing. It shouldn't take hours, by the way. It shouldn't even take days. It should be very simple to figure out how something happened like that. What was taken? And that's actually kind of important, because that's going to define partially the extent of a data breach and therefore the cost of a data breach. And we'll talk more about that in a couple of slides. But what exactly was taken? And then also, why was it done? And this is kind of important, because the why provides context. Did somebody do it maliciously? Did they do it because they were an unwitting participant? Did they not think it was a problem, it was okay to do? And the why actually helps you address not so much the data breach issue of let's close the security hole or identify the files that were transferred, but the aspect of, do we fire the employee or not? If they were an unwitting participant, didn't realize that they clicked on something that was a phishing scam, got some malware installed, and then a file got copied off their machine, you shouldn't fire them. So why comes into play. And all of these together, with probably the exception of what, all help define context. It's going to define the context around the reasoning why it happened. Is it something you have to be worried about? Should you address it? How should you address it? And so on. Now, even though you've got these 4 questions, once you have that, you have to kind of figure out what you should be watching. And that's the next step here. Generally speaking, you're probably going to focus on some of these 4 areas here. You see, access to data, maybe looking at the security settings and so on. Maybe you're going to look at the data itself. Maybe looking at network traffic or application use, or you're going to look at access to a file server. All of these different areas are typically where you're trying to focus on. And I'm going to submit to you that may actually not be the best way. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying it may not be the best way. And the reason why I want to submit to you is if you look at those types of things that you normally watch when you're talking about an insider and data breaches. I want to kind of put those concepts together first. You're looking at access, data, network, application use, when people hit a file server and so on, maybe even firewall logs, this kind of thing. So you're looking at those sources. You're talking about the insider, and you're talking about they breached some data. The reason why I'd say that's not the best way is because what you're doing is you're watching something that the employee interacts with instead of just watching the employee. Which makes more sense? Staring at a USB drive and watching it and seeing what happens with it, or doing the equivalent of putting a video camera over the shoulder of the employee and record from the moment they sit down to the moment they get up and capture everything that they do. In the one case, in the former case, you're only looking at the USB stick. It's only if they use that USB stick you're going to capture anything, right? If they go on Dropbox or if they email something out to a Yahoo account or they use FTP, you're going to miss it entirely because you're trying to watch something the user interacts with. If you're watching the user themselves, you're going to see everything they do. You're going to even see if they decide to download some program of their own that uses some weird port address that goes across. Maybe it just uses port 80 or 443 for SSL or something and transfers something over, a secure sockets layer session you're not even aware of existed. You'd see that. So the idea is, either you have to watch everything that they're going to interact with, which you really can't do because you don't know everything they're utilizing, or you just need to watch the employee themselves. So let's take a look at that a little bit more as well by looking at user activity monitoring as a concept. If you're unfamiliar with user activity monitoring, what it is, in essence, is an ability to get a total view of what an employee is doing on their computer. And then in some cases, you can even take groups of users or an entire department or an entire company. But you're getting a comprehensive view of everything they do on the computer. So whether it's using email, they're using the web, they're using it like an FTP or a transfer program of some kind, if they're using USB sticks or they're opening data, they're manipulating it, whatever the case is, you get a total view. It kind of works in 3 parts. The first part is recording, and you record everything that the user does. Now you got to think kind of tactically here. Think of like, if they use email, they use chat, they use applications, they use the web, they type keystrokes, they print, they open documents, they save them, and so on. You record all of those things along with a screen capture or screen snapshots. And that way you have a visual record of what they did, as well as the data record of the individual activities. But if you just stop there and say, now go look at it, you go, that's too much information. I have 1,000 employees. And what you really want to be able to do is to whittle down not 1,000 employees, even down to just say 5, 2, or even 1 employee. Really what you'd want to do, if you think about it, is you say, if I had all that information, I need to be able to whittle it down to the one activity of one user that I need to be focusing on. I want to know, sub Tuesday at 2:35, they did something that was wrong. That's what you need to whittle down to. So that's the second part of user activity monitoring, is typically alerting, where you're being alerted based on either keywords that show up in an application or typed or in an email, on a web page, and so on, or activity-based. Something like, let's say, a person in sales prints more than 50 documents, and you go, that might be suspect. And then you have the ability then to go in and review that data and even play it back. Again, that visual record, play back what the employee did. And so what you're able to do here now is detect a breach by proactively watching everything they do, be notified when something suspect happens, and then review the data and see, is it good or is it bad? And again, that issue of why coming up, one of those 4 things you need to be looking at when you detect breaches. The why is important, especially with that ability to review the screen snapshots, because if you can look before, during, and after an activity in question, you really are going to get context. Somebody copies a bunch of confidential documents to a USB stick. Well, if their boss just previously said in an email, would you please copy these documents? I'm going to be going to New York tomorrow and I need a copy of them. Then you know that the employee is just following their orders and they didn't do anything wrong themselves. Maybe the boss might be suspect, but that's a whole other issue. Now, how does user activity monitoring differ from other kinds of solutions? The first thing is it's the right place at the right time. You're always recording at the source. Even if someone went across SNL, like Saturday Night Live, listen to me, an SSL session, which is going to encrypt everything. So if you use let's say a firewall or maybe a network monitoring tool or something, if you don't have SSL proxies in place, you're going to see nothing but garbled information. So you have no detail. Because you're working at one end of the session, you're always at the right place at the right time. You're always going to see what the employee's doing, and it's unencrypted. The next thing is that you get activities in context. I just mentioned that. Before, during, and after the activity in question, you get context of why it happened, what was done, what were the reasons, is there collusion going on, and so on. And then you get anytime, anywhere, in any medium, and that kind of speaks back to the fact that it could be in email or chat or on webmail or on the internet. Web browsing, could be using SSL. It doesn't matter. You always get it. And the last part here is that it's admissible in court. This kind of activity, because you have such a detailed amount of information, it allows you to take appropriate action up to and including legal action. So how do you define the cost of a breach? Now, obviously, I want to do this within the context of maybe using user activity monitoring, but defining the cost of a breach still applies even if you're not using user activity monitoring. And the first thing I want to do here is ask you a question. What happens when you can't prove the extent of a breach? You have these data breach notification laws in place, and they're there for a reason, saying you've got to tell every person that might have been impacted. So if you have let's say 1,000 records in your database, you think they only stole 10, but you can't prove it. So what happens when you can't prove the extent of a breach? How many do you have to assume were involved in that breach? And most of you are probably going, all of them. Exactly, all of them. And so keep in mind things like, per record costs. When you look at different surveys, it's as much as like $200 a record. And if you have 1 million records, do the math really fast, right? You don't want to do that. So being able to define the extent of a breach is going to definitely help lower the cost of a breach. And so the idea here is with something like user activity monitoring, you're able to define the extent then very easily, because you can see clearly if I go back in time, because I've been recording an employee proactively, I can see they only copied these 10 records. Therefore, I know that the extent of the breach is 10 records. I can prove it. They never got any other data, and so on. Now you've reduced your cost. So the other way you do this is you have to expand the time frames and mediums normally. You're going to have to look back even farther and go across more mediums than just the one that maybe you normally caught. Without UAM, this is what would be involved. Maybe you found that they posted that, like Telstra, they put a Excel spreadsheet up on Google. Well, but what else did they do? Did they maybe send something out to themselves in a Yahoo account via webmail? Did they stick it on a USB stick? You got to expand the time frame and the mediums. But with UAM, user activity monitoring, it's far easier. You can simply go back in time and see what else that employee was doing. Yeah, I kind of already talked about that, so we'll keep going. So, kind of in summary here, insider threats are definitely on the rise. You see that 250% increase from year over year with Verizon's data breach investigations report. To detect data breaches, you've got to be able to quickly identify that it happened, because months to years doesn't cut it, right? There's a lot of damage that can happen there, and therefore that impacts company reputation, cost to fix the problems, and so on. You also need to be able to define the extent to keep the cost lower, and then having context is going to let you be able to identify what kinds of actions you should take against the employee. And or is it really something you need to be worried about? Is it really a data breach? Like if they sent it to themselves out on Yahoo, then you maybe know it's okay. They were just trying to get it at home, that kind of thing. And then having a good detection strategy is going to minimize those notification costs, whether it's with UAM or not, just because that way you have the ability of knowing what the extent of the breach was. And then the last thing here, just to kind of push this back out to you, using user activity monitoring because you're watching the employee and not things that they interact with, is probably the most sure method you have to detecting an insider threat, because you're going regardless of medium, regardless of transport mechanism, and so on, including data breaches. So I hope this has been sort of informative for you. You got something out of this a little bit. I think I'm going to throw it back to Greg. Greg, we probably have a couple of questions we can answer. I see we've got about 3.5 minutes left in our time.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much for that presentation. Yes, we do have a number of questions that have come in. Are you ready to go into it?
Yeah, let's just jump through a couple. Let's get through as many as we can in the next couple of minutes.
Okay. You mentioned the majority of data breaches take seconds to hours. Can you clarify that statement?
Oh, sure. So good. I'm glad they actually asked me to clarify that. So that's the exfiltration portion of it. That is just the part of the breach where someone is taking the data out. There's still the part where they're trying to actually break into the environment, locate the data, and then take it out and so on. And after that is the discovery. So the exfiltration taking seconds to hours, that's just one portion. So it probably takes a little bit longer, but even those types of categories like initial compromise of the network and so on also are still taking seconds to hours, particularly with like insider threats. You're talking about an insider with access. There is no compromise. They already have access to the data, so it's not like they have to hack into something. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks. How would user monitoring know that a data breach occurred?
Okay, great question. So user activity monitoring, like in the case of our own solution, but other solutions use very similar tactics. They use keywords and they use activity. Keywords would be utilized around, let's say, I'll give you a really good real-world example. Ernst & Young and the FBI came out with a list of about 3,000 some odd different phrases together. They released this out a couple months ago, the news about this. And they would help identify potential examples of fraud. There were phrases like "nobody will find out." It seems kind of stupid to say "no one will ever find out," but that kind of phrase, or "just between us," or "off the books," that sort of thing. Those keywords help identify fraud. And so keywords are one great action. The other one is, again, activities. I used the example earlier of someone printing more than 50 documents. That might identify maybe someone's leaving the organization if you're watching sales. But the benefit here is being able to look at contextually with other employees in the same department and see if that number stands out. Is 50 documents, as an example, way above what sales normally does? That gives you some context. Yes, it is. Let's go drill in a little deeper, see what those documents were. Let's drill in a little deeper. Let's watch what they were doing, and see if what they're doing is trying to copy out information out of, let's say, the customer database or something like that.
Okay. Someone is asking, how do your products work? Is there a database, a dashboard, what?
Okay, good question. Most products work the same way as ours. There's a client agent running, in our case, on Windows and Mac machines. We also support BlackBerry to a limited extent. And that data is pulled in from those agents back to a central SQL database, and then you utilize a dashboard application to interact with the data and pull reports, view the activity, and so on.
Okay, will this work for an external threats as well, such as from a hacker?
Okay, good question. Only the aspect of where the insiders, the unwitting participants, so let's say the external threat hackers using like a phishing scam, you could utilize this to also help determine what it was that an employee did, what they interacted with, in order to allow the hacker to have access. So it's not really going to help with a true external threat of, let's say, someone is trying to do some kind of denial of service attack to do maybe a buffer overflow or something on a service, and then be able to have access to a server. It's not going to help there. It's going to help any time that an insider is involved. And those threats that Verizon talks about, where there's 92% and 14%, add that up. It's more than 100, right? You know there's overlap between the two. So it would definitely help with some of the external threats.
Okay. Nick, I think we have time for one more question. This
Sure.
seems to be a follow-up to that one. Does this work like a forensic tool to determine what a user did on their computer?
Okay, good question. Forensics tools typically are used to go back and either look at information like, let's say, your browser history, or it might go and try and find deleted files, things like that, and figure out what you did by building clues. This is different. This is a point in time moving forward once you have the solution installed. The idea is you can replay any of that time frame. Could be your days, weeks, months, years of information, as long as you have it collected. So forensics is definitely like, I think I have a problem. I'm going to start today. I want to go backwards. You need a forensics tool for that. If you want to be more proactive, because you already know that you have problems in your organization, you're just not sure where, a user activity monitoring solution would fit there, where you'd start from today moving forward, and then you have an ability at the next point in time, in the future, when you go, all right, I think I have an issue, you can replay all the way back to today, if you will. Hopefully that answers their question.
Okay, thanks. And with that, we're going to have to wrap it up for this session. So let me thank SpectorSoft's Nick Cavalancia for sharing his insight and expertise today. And of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in. We can now escort you over to our virtual expo hall, and you could visit the SpectorSoft booth where reps are on hand to answer any further questions you might have. This webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Magazine website under the Events tab. We have one more session coming up in today's e-symposium, so we hope you can stick around for that one as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.